for this public forum webinar. This webinar and public forum is produced and put together by Association for Peace and Unity in Ethiopia. And this is part of a campaign for political reform to the ethnic-based system of government in Ethiopia. The campaign is an effort to initiate grassroots social movements to influence the current political reform process by educating and mobilizing the people, just like the civil rights movement in the United States in the 60s. Ethiopians have faced so many ethnic-based conflicts and wars since the introduction of ethnic federalism by TPLF. The problem caused millions of Ethiopians to lose their lives and millions others got displaced. APUE believes a lasting solution to stabilize the nation and ensure peace in Ethiopia and in the Horn is to reform the constitution. This ongoing campaign has four main points that it's advocating for. One is amending the constitution to be based on citizenship rather than ethnicity, ensuring that every individual is granted equal rights and protection. And then second, restructure the ethnic-based administrative borders, kilils, into a geographic system that fosters unity and true federalism with equal rights to all citizens. Third, prohibit the formation of political parties based on ethnicity. Fourth, and the last one, is bringing all ethnic-based kilil armed forces, especially forces and militias, under the federal military. For today's public forum, two accomplished individuals will share their research and analysis with us and for us to reflect and share our ideas. Our first panelist will be Professor Theodore Ted Vestal. He enjoyed a successful career throughout the world in government service and in an academy. Professor Vestal is a professor emeritus of political science at Oklahoma State University, where he taught for 20 years. A lifetime singer, Vestal graduated with the highest honor from the University of North Texas, where he held the Phi Mu Alpha Sinfona Scholarship in Vocal Arts throughout his college career. He studied law at Yale on scholarship, higher education at Harvard, and received his master's and PhD in political science and U.S. history from Stanford. In 2005, Vestal was the first American to hold the prestigious Hiob Lidolf Endowed Professorship on Current Issues of Ethiopian Studies at Hamburg University's Institute for Asian and African Studies. In that role, he wrote and edited articles for 5-volume Encyclopedia Ethiopica. His major public address in Hamburg, The Line of Judah and the New World, about the influence of Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia in shaping America's attitude towards Africa, came the outline for his book by the same title that was published in 2011. He has multiple publications, such as Haile Selassie's Ethiopia Revisited, Ethiopia, a post-Cold War African state. And in the latter book, he explores the strategy of EPRDF, defining and providing new constitution and how that affected the community and the society and the reshaping of how Ethiopia political system is going forward. And he provides analysis of the constitution of EPRDF. And moving on to our second panelist and presenter is Professor Binyam Awash, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Seni Onyota University. Served as senior research aide at the Institute for Asia and Asian Diasporas from 2006 to 2010, and research associate at the Research Foundation, State University of New York from 2009 and 2011. He's the founding member of International Consortium for Geopolitical Studies of the Sahel and member of Hope for Ethiopia. His research interests include sociology of climate change, war and political violence, and world order system change. His forthcoming publications focusing on political violence and state making in Ethiopia includes Republic of Violence, Class and Ethnicity in the Making of Republican Ethiopia, and Beyond Ethnic Federalism. These are our two esteemed panelists for today, and they will be sharing with us their knowledge, their years of research and observation, and I leave the floor to Professor Vestal. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I was present when many of the groundworks were laid for ethnic federalism in Ethiopia and when the Constitution was adopted. So I'm speaking from my experience of having been active in Ethiopia at that time. Two important definitions before we get started. One is democracy, which in power terms is concerned with power being widely shared. Can you think of power being widely shared under the TPLF, virtually a one-party state? The other definition of importance is federalism, which is power divided. It's one thing to have power divided on paper, as was the case in the Constitution with ethnic federalism, but it was something else to have a meaningful sharing of power between a central government and state governments or smaller governments. So with those two definitions in mind, let's look back historically at what happened in terms of creating the ethnic federalism that we're concerned with at the present time and the adoption of the Constitution back in the 1990s. The civil war in Ethiopia, in which the Derg was being assaulted by several different groups, many of which were ethnically based, resulted in a victory on the battlefield by the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF, and the EPRDF, which was a conglomeration of Ethiopian fighting groups under the leadership of the Tigrayan People's Revolutionary Front. In May 1991, a London Peace Conference was called, and the U.S. was very involved in presence at that conference with Herman Cohen, a name that will be important in the history of the beginning of the transitional government. In July 1991, the EPRDF, with the diplomatic backing of the United States, held its founding party and organized a national conference in Addis Ababa. The EPLF and EPRDF had won the war, according to the U.S. State Department, and the EPRDF was, in effect, given permission to enter Addis Ababa to restore public order and prevent further bloodshed. The next important activity was setting up a transition period, transitional government of Ethiopia supervising a process culminating in the drafting of a democratic constitution to be ratified by a newly elected National Assembly. This all place under the Transition Period Charter. The Transitional Government of Ethiopia, the TGE, had a president. This was Meles, who was elected to that post by the National Conference. There was a legislative body, the Council of Representatives, the COR, which was composed of representatives from national liberation movements, other political organizations, and prominent individuals. Given that description of the membership, you can see that it could be easily controlled by the TPLF. Members of the COR were not elected by the people, but were appointed by the organizations they represented. The most controversial provision of the charter affirmed, quotes, the rights of nations, nationalities, and peoples to self-determination, including a guarantee of the right of such ethnic groups to secede. In late 1991, the Transitional Parliament, the COR, directed the reorganization of Ethiopia into new administrative divisions composed of 12 regions based on nationality or ethnicity and 2 cities, Addis Ababa and Aurora, with regional status. My first connection with the transitional government was as a consultant to the COR shortly after it came into being. So I was in Ethiopia under a program funded by the U.S. Information Agency. So I worked closely with the TPLF or the EPRDF at that time and learned how they always seemed to have a majority of whatever group was involved. They always made sure they had half of the membership plus 1 so that they could win all elections, which was their specialty. The district and regional elections of 1992 set up the new government and provided for the creation of a new constitution. I served as an election observer in that election. So again, I got to see how the TPLF operated even in an election setting. With many different observers on hand, the government claimed that the elections were free and fair, but a good deal of writing at that time would disagree with that evaluation. The credo of ethnicity was coming into being at this time. If the TPLF could keep other ethnic groups divided and roiled against each other to be content to manage affairs only in their own limited bailiwicks, then larger matters could be subsumed by the one governing party. Thus, what the transitional government of Ethiopia viewed as the false ideology of nationalism for a greater Ethiopia could be kept in check and its proponents divided and conquered. Both government and civil society were fragmented on the basis of ethnicity. In the post-Derg era, ethnicity seems to refer to tribal origin. In June 1992, there was a 68-page Amharic document, Our Revolutionary Democratic Goals and the Next Steps. This was the party's plan for gaining and maintaining political control of Ethiopia. Revolutionary democracy was used in place of earlier Marxist-Leninist rhetoric. So the top goal of the Revolutionary Democratic Goals was to establish hegemony. This was one of the favorite words of the TPLF. And they did whatever it took to win all elections and to destroy effective political opposition. In August 1992, the Constitution Drafting Commission came into being. Members of the commission were elected by the COR from among various sections of the population and members of the COR. Again, it's easy to see how such a group could be dominated by the group setting it up. Again, I was present when the Constitution Drafting Commission came into being. I wrote a long memo to the chairman of the committee using American Constitution writing as a basis for suggestions for his committee. I'm not sure it was ever widely circulated within the committee. There was a symposium on the making of the new Ethiopian Constitution held in Addis in 17 through 21 of May 1993, under the sponsorship of the Inter-Africa Group, a non-government organization with close ties to the transitional government. I took part in that meeting, in fact, helped plan it, and there were some excellent people, very fine papers given, but I'm not sure they made much difference in terms of what the Constitution was going to be drafted as. In April 1994, a draft constitution was delivered to the COR, and it was unanimously approved. The election of the Constituent Assembly took place on 5th of June, 1994. Parliamentary elections were in May 1995 to choose a National Assembly and to establish the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. And under the Constitution, the first principle was that all sovereign power emanates from ethnic groups. Now, that this is not we the people, this is we the ethnic groups. And the country then operated with the mischief of ethnic factions as the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. In May of 1995, another secret document came to light, a guideline for the PRDF's organizational structure and operation in Amharic. It's interesting that both of the documents that set up the TPLF and its modus operandi were secret documents made public in the Ethiopia Review for the first time in English. These documents outline the alchemy of ethnic distrust. Let me add that there can be a benevolent side to ethnic belonging, positive appreciation of one's own social roots in a community and cultural group without necessarily disparaging other groups. Ethnicity can provide material as well as emotional support networks for individuals in society. Identifying with an ethnic group fosters a sense of belonging as part of an intermediate level of social relationships between the individual and society. Democracy in Ethiopia will require institutions and laws, but it will depend on what might be called democratic dispositions. These include a preparedness to work with others different from oneself towards shared goals, combination of strong convictions with a readiness to compromise in the recognition that one cannot always get everything one wants, and a sense of individuality and a commitment to civic goods that are not the possession of one person or of one small group alone. Ethiopia then must liberate itself from the shifting past and enter into a new era with an interweaving of separate ethnic strands into a new national design. To secure the public and private rights against the danger of ethnic factions, and at the same time to create a truly democratic government, it is the great object to which freedom-loving Ethiopians should direct their thoughts and their individual actions. Following its guiding documents, the EPRDF personified a new form of authoritarianism, the subtler tyrannies of the post-Cold War world. The country limped on, wearing the thick boot of authoritarianism at the end of one leg and the iron of ethnic hatred on the other. I can go on at great length about these early sorts of ethnic federalism and the one-party rule that the country ended up operating under. But I'll stop there and ask the chairman to move on to the next item.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ted. We really appreciate your walking us through the historic, how it came about and the backgrounds, and from your perspective as well, where you were in person involved and looking at these different junctures in up close and personal. So that's extremely helpful. We're grateful for your knowledge, your experience, and your contribution to the Ethiopian community, the academia as well. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm sure there will be questions at the end, but for now, we'll move on to our next presenter, Professor Binyam.
Thank you so much. First, greetings to everyone. Thank you for organizing this panel, and greetings to Professor Vestal as well. I think in the introduction, I should actually say I'm a junior scholar, and actually I learned quite a bit from Professor Vestal's work. Particularly, I read his work as an undergraduate student on ethnic federalism. And that was when my eyes were opened to the internal inconsistencies, problems, and of course, the political story behind the formation of ethnic federalism. So I'd like to recognize and thank Professor Vestal for his role as a teacher as well. Eid Mubarak to all my Muslim brothers and sisters. So I wanted to start off, I have about 15 minutes or so, and what I wanted to talk about was perhaps to briefly touch on the genesis of ethnic federalism, and to speak, maybe identify several inherent problems, in fact, with ethnic federalism as a political system. And lastly, to raise one or two points to begin a discussion on ways of thinking of a different form of political arrangement that does not leave us in the trap of ethnic federalism. So first, in terms of this discussion of ethnic federalism, usually this discussion of ethnic federalism as a political system is met with trepidation. And there's a reason for why I think that there's a certain sense of trepidation or kind of going around the bush, so to speak, when we speak about ethnic federalism. And I would say that there's three main reasons why, three senses. The first has to do with the historical genesis of political system. So this political system of ethnic federalism is established by organized insurgent groups, the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, with its base in one of the provinces of Ethiopia, which is Tigray, the Oromo Liberation Front, with its base primarily in Wallagga area, region of Ethiopia. And of course, we shouldn't forget the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, which is a key insurgent movement in the former province of Ethiopia during this time. And the time period that we're talking about is around the 1970s in the European calendar, moving on to 1991, where you had the reorganization of the Ethiopian state. And so when we look at the way in which ethnic federalism is discussed, and discussed in a way that is almost apologetic, so to speak, right? And the reasons why that's the case. One is the fact that it's presented as a fait accompli, that the ethnically mobilized political organizations in Ethiopia had a correct diagnosis of the problems of the Ethiopian state and society, and they organized a political platform, and that platform was victorious. And because of that, ethnic federalism is a symbol of the correct political perspective. And so that's why it's not necessarily easily broached. The second is that it is conceptualized as no alternative. So when we think of a discussion of ethnic federalism, there's trepidation because of the idea that the unitary nature of the Ethiopian state, the way in which the violent confrontations and political polarizations of Ethiopian history, these have been resolved or addressed by this unique system called ethnic federalism. And there's no other alternative to this system. First prime minister of this system, Prime Minister Mallas, was very open in speaking of the fact that either we have ethnic federalism or we will never have Ethiopia, that it was always on the cusp of dissolving, of fracturing, of breaking up. And lastly, Ethiopian case is made as an exception. Those are the three senses, right? So the last third sense is that the Ethiopian case of having 80 plus different cultural groups on the basis of language. Now, there's different cultures in the Ethiopian social landscape. And so the idea that we have a very diverse and rich cultural social landscape poses in the political thinking a problem of how to create a common political community. And so this political problem then is seen to be as somehow bedeviling Ethiopia, which is very problematic. Secondarily, you can think of it as a problem of an empire. Ethiopia is conceptualized as an empire. And so again, there are various empires that did not use an ethnic federal type of political arrangement to resolve these political problems. So those are the three senses which I think we can have a discussion if necessary in terms of depth, but they are fallacious in nature. The reason why they are there is essentially to close off any type of discussion, any type of analysis, and any type of search for alternative mechanisms of creating political communities, nation states, or a state and a different political community in Ethiopia that could address some of the key roots, key problems. So now that I lay it out in terms of just thinking about the genesis itself, so why and how did ethnic federalism come to be? So first, we can think of ethnic federalism as achieving a goal. So what is the ethnic federalism is a tool. It's a tool of it's a means of achieving a certain goal. And that goal had to do with the key problems that were identified that were inherent in sort of the Ethiopian political sort of history. One had to do with the proliferation of violent conflict because communities were excluded. So there was violence. There was a political community, particularly in the imperial period, where different groups in Ethiopia were excluded from power, excluded from citizenship, excluded also from the cultural community. So how we think about Ethiopia and what pops up, you may not think of someone from Benishangul Gumuz as an example. And that is a reflection, again, of the process of cultural exclusion. So these are some of the problems that were identified. Another element that was very important is the exploitation, meaning the type of economic arrangement that was existing in Ethiopia that was excluding a majority of the inhabitants. So ethnic federalism was seen as one of the ways in which this can be addressed. So the first problem, if you will, and thinking about this is, let's go back to the period of 1974 to 1991. And I'll speak very briefly about that. This is the first time in which you have a secular Republican state. It was a revolution, a formidable and remarkable historical event of a global nature, actually, the 1974 Ethiopian Revolution. And what it did was it resolved some of the key issues in Ethiopian society at that time: political, economic, and social. The political had to do with the rearrangement of Ethiopia as a republic. It became a secular republic as opposed to a monarchy that was tied to a particular religion as well. Secondarily, the economic aspect. there was a division of Ethiopia between the north and the south, in which the south had a kind of a feudal type of arrangement, and the north had a different type of arrangement, Rista Gult, that allowed, let's say, the equivalent of independent operators or independent businesses, except these are farms. So they had a significant amount of rights. So this political arrangement or economic arrangement that also resulted in a dual citizenship, somewhat more full citizenship to one class of people in the north, and denigrated or second-class citizenship to a significant chunk of the Ethiopian population in the south. So with that revolution, that was addressed. What you had is a single citizenship for all Ethiopians. Lastly, the cultural aspect, the social aspect. So Ethiopia does have a nationality problem, and that is, to what extent are all communities reflected in the political community in Ethiopia? And in that sense, there was some headway towards addressing cultural discrimination and intercultural relationships during that period of 1974-1991. Lastly, for the genesis, in thinking about, again, this was never resolved, some of the pathways to redesigning Ethiopia's administrative system, to thinking about the devolution of power for self-administration at local levels, the existing government at that time, which created a party called the Workers' Party of Ethiopia. And around 1984, which obviously during the period of the Cold War was facing formidable resistance, both from outside and inside the country, nevertheless attempted to put together a commission that would actually look at the different arrangements that could be had to create a solution to some of these key problems. And one of the recommendations was to create an ethnic-based federal system. There was 5 different recommendations. And so that ethnic-based federal system was rejected by that government. Rather, it looked at different arrangements, again, to resolve the key issues that both ethnic nationalists today, as well as those that are considered non-ethnic nationalists, both agree are symptoms of a deeper crisis. So already it tells you that there were various alternatives rather than simply ethnic federalism at that time. So that's for the genesis. Now we have ethnic federalism that was established in Ethiopia from 1991 to this very day. And one of the interesting things I would identify in terms of its inherent problems, and there's really significant problems. First is that you had a remaking of the Ethiopian state. As Professor Vestal indicated, there was a reconstitution of the Ethiopian state in terms of boundary administrative provinces, in which you have the creation of 9 ethnic-based provinces and several two federally administered states. Now, the logic here, which is very interesting, is we have the politicization of ethnicity. So why only 9 sort of ethnic regions? What is the standard that was used? If you have 80 plus languages, or 80 plus, let's say, ethnicities, right? So that's one, but that's a very minor one. The most significant aspect is the kind of citizenship that is created. We move from a citizenship in which all Ethiopians, as long as they belong to the state and the political community of Ethiopia within that territory, are equal citizens. That was the Republican experience from 1974 to 1991. The new transformation was that you were now a citizen by only belonging to an ethnic community. So if you do not belong to an ethnic community, you do not have citizenship, and you do not have the political, economic, and social rights that go with it. That is a fundamental transformation in the type of citizenship that is produced. That's one. A second element, which is interesting, is that even in the Constitution itself, this idea of sovereignty is bestowed upon, say, the people, etc. In this case, it's on the peoples, nations, and nationalities. And it's really interesting. If you remember, I just indicated that one of the key problems in the Ethiopian political and social landscape is a significant exclusion of different groups of Ethiopian within the larger polity. Benishangul Gumuz, various groups, Gambela, various groups, Afar, in Somali, etc. So you can think of the Ethiopian political inclusion as 3 circles. The first circle can be inclusive. The second circle is less inclusive. And the third circle is the least exclusive or inclusive. And so what we have here is the definition of nations and nationalities and peoples, very interestingly, reproduces exclusion. So what that means is that with the exception of with the first circle, the most included, such as the larger ethnic groups, Tigray, Amara, Oromo, Somali, those and the outer and third circle, smaller micro minorities, Majangir, Nur, Anwak, etc., are highly excluded from this political system, even though it's based on ethnicity. So that's another aspect to think about. The third element I would like to introduce here, which is very problematic, is that ethnic federalism creates within every region majorities and minorities. But that's not what's relevant. What's relevant is that within every region is thought of as a tribal homeland. You have a division between natives and settlers, between those that it's their home and those that they are foreign to that region. And so because of that, and what the Constitution does is it creates two categories of citizens. Those citizens in that region which are considered natives are sovereign citizens. Those citizens that live within that region that are considered foreign or settlers are considered non-sovereign. And non-sovereign means they do not have the ability to participate and have power, to have political office. They do not have any role in economic resources and having a say over economic resources in the places that they reside. So this already, in this system of governance, legally is creating a system of discrimination. Every single region in the federation systematically discriminates against a category of residents of Ethiopians who are considered non-citizens, meaning non-sovereign, non-rights bearing foreigners or settlers within a particular province. And this creates incredible levels of disenfranchisement, as you can note. Lastly, just to summarize very quickly, there's several other points perhaps in the discussion I'd like to raise, but another element I think which is very, very important is the relationship between the center and the regions. So in this constitution, the fundamental transformation that occurred in Ethiopia at the 1974 revolution, one of which was the Land Reform Act of 1975, which transformed both the economic fortunes of Ethiopians and the political citizenship equality of Ethiopians in one stroke. What's very interesting here is that land now and resources are defined as belonging to the state. And so in this new system, because power is devolved to ethnic regions, and each region belongs to a majority, usually conceptualized as an ethnicity, then each region's resources are the exclusive ownership of that majority, which is sovereign, right, by law. And this creates the devolution of power, but in actuality does not actually allow, even as faulty as the system is, does not allow regional states to have sovereign authority over the resources. And a great example of this, and the reason for why we're having the discussion, because it's an opportunity to think about redesigning ethnic federalism in a period which we all have identified as a reform period. The reason why we have this significant contradiction is the land grab, almost a decades long, that we saw. So for instance, the land grab activity that was happening in Ethiopia, but was much more global in nature, obviously. But Ethiopia was one of the primary targets of foreign direct investment in order to capture free land and free water practically. And so the Ethiopian state at that time organized a land bureau at the federal level, and it arrogated 5,000 hectares and over was the prerogative of the federal authority to determine who gets land on that 5,000 plots. So 5,000 plots and over would be allocated by the federal authority. This goes against the actual constitution and the devolution of power. And because of that, you saw places like Gambela, Benishangul, the Amara regions, Oromia, etc., around the country, massive displacements of Ethiopian farmers, of pastoralists and agro-pastoralists on the authority of the federal central government, right, which was anti-constitutional. So we also have this problem, again, between actual devolution of power and self-rule, the extent to which people are participating in deciding and controlling the conditions of their life. So that's the last point I would say is violence. One of the key issues that's permeating Ethiopian political transformation over time, as we've seen, particularly the Republican era, which is from 1974 to today, is a constant level of violence and violent type of politics. And what we see here, and this is my last point, ethnic federalism was meant to decrease violence. It was meant to create peace and stability. What it has actually done is something very interesting. The type of violence that we've had during 1974 to 1991 was a violence between organized political actors, insurgent groups, and the state. The type of violence that we have today is qualitatively different, and it's qualitatively more destabilizing, and it's very dangerous, and it's very hurtful and deep-rooted. And that is a violence between communities, simply because of the way politics is organized around collectives called ethnicity, and how ethnicities are used to mobilize and fight for resources, for political power in this system. So we don't have a decrease in violence, we have an increase in violence, and we have a new, much more debilitating type of violence that pits community against community. And that is why, for instance, the war in the north that, thank goodness, had subsided through the peace agreement that we've had for 2 years, that's why it was, for many Ethiopians, a shock in terms of the brutality and the way in which it had a people-to-people war character. And that is no different than what we see, again, in various provinces in Ethiopia. So the violence is both qualitatively different, people to people, and the violence also, lastly, is facilitating ethnic cleansing in every single region. Whether it actually happens or not depends on the political circumstances. And I think those are some of the inherent problems that are very problematic. I've taken quite a bit of time. And so the only thing I would mention with respect to a possible pathway, and maybe in discussions we can continue, is simply to say that the first and foremost reform that we need is we need to transition from a system that legalizes discrimination around Ethiopia in every single region to one that promotes non-discrimination and equality, and hence citizenship on the basis of residence and not on the basis of ethnicity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Binyam, and that was a great analysis in terms of what currently is happening, referencing to what we all know as the divisions and the systematic division between people and the so-called empowering the different ethnicities and communities, but what actually has led us to. And I feel like this just ethnic division is so engraved in our minds that we Ethiopians as a community need a new mind shift. Our mindset has to shift beyond that. And I think platforms like this and hearing from educators and folks in the academia and has done research, such as you guys, is extremely helpful to see what is the data, what is the research, what does it look like. And of course, Ethiopians are extremely patriotic and we're very emotional about our nation, who we are, and it's really deep rooted, and that gets us overly emotional, and we tend not to be reasonable when we think about this. And you've mentioned that, Professor Binyam, earlier when you said, it's very hard for us as a people to even talk about this, to discuss it in a civilized manner, to see what the going forward, what it could be. So, and as we're going towards the question, and we'll have questions coming in, I just have one question. We've talked about, what the issue is and where it came from historically, and where it has placed the community and the society as we speak today. But I wanted to know where is the right place to start, right? We all have that, the right path to take, and this is where we're going to end up. This is as a community, as a governance, as a political system, this is what we want to have in Ethiopia. But what is the right first step? And I feel like, different people have different opinions on what that right first step is. Some people disagree on, what's in place, what other people say. But I'm curious to hear from you both, from what you know, from your analysis and your studies. What do you think the first right step is towards this process? And Professor Vestal, I'll go with you first.
I think the beginning is already in place at a reconciliation committee or conference to bring out what the problems are and try to answer some of the questions about where do we go from here, and how do we move the reconciliation ideas into a meaningful structure. And this could be done by a constitutional amendment or constitutional amendments, or it could be done with a new constitution. So these would be some of the questions I think that would be appropriate to take on early.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Vestal. Professor Binyam?
I thought that the initial process of reform was really interesting. In fact, in retrospect, as I see it, is actually much more interesting. I think many people, when the EPRDF was in crisis, and you had an internal process of reform that produced then a new political sort of face, if you will. The violence that were perpetrated against Ethiopian people, the theft, the corruption, theft, etc., but specifically the violence, extreme levels of violence over quite a bit of time that was committed on the Ethiopian people. We did not have a strategy of going after individuals that committed these crimes, right? So the way in which we were transitioning in Ethiopia was not on the basis of finding criminal offenders, bringing them to justice, and thereby giving some sort of closure or political justice even. The reform took on, which was a little difficult for some people to swallow, but sort of a blanket amnesty. So there was a blanket amnesty, but it was tied to a commitment to a political reform of the system. So if we look at it today, many people can point, for instance, that, okay, perhaps it's the TPLF that's the problem, but it's no longer part of the political landscape. So what actually is the problem? Is it individuals? Is it a single party? Or is it the system? So it is the system. And I think the African continent actually provides us historically with examples for how to begin this process. It's not the only place. I'm not being Afrocentric, although it's nice to be Afrocentric. But the African continent, I would say, particularly in the Ethiopian case, in some cases it could be exaggeration, but the system that we have in Ethiopia is almost analogous to South African apartheid, except it's not on the basis of racialization, but it's on the basis of, again, taking identity, in this case, something like ethnicity, could be language, and taking language and politicizing it. And on that basis, discriminating both by private and public institutions, right? So the transition in South Africa was one of political reform. And that political reform that started, at least the promise of it, should be nurtured, right? So whether the actors that are involved, let's say the ruling party and the governing party, are actually good stewards of that, I think is by now, perhaps people have clear ideas about that, but that doesn't mean that Ethiopians can be excluded. So I would say that is a very important aspect. Another aspect I would say is that in the discussion about ethnic federalism, we have to be very sensitive to a fact. The fact is that there is something called a nationality problem, right? Which is this question of exclusion and cultural marginalization. So as an example, we talk in many cases about, we think of groups in Ethiopia on the basis of ethnicity. What if we think of groups in Ethiopia on the basis of gender? So are women excluded in Ethiopia? Do they actually, are they included in its political life and economic life? Do women perform unpaid labor that is never valued and actually remunerated? Right. So there's a woman's question, which was exciting, a part of the 1974 process of revolution, which never was took up, by the way. And another element to think about is, what if we look at Ethiopians in the context of livelihood between pastoralists, who then would be Afar, Somali, Karayu, etc., various groups, but their common denominator is around the livelihood system, etc. So what we need is an inclusive Asad Kafi vision with respect to the type of reform. And we have to be very sensitive to that. And I think in the panels that you're organizing and the groups like yours that are pushing for a public conversation, that spirit of inclusiveness and thinking about how is it that we can learn from the past and build upon is very important.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Binyam. Thank you, Professor Vestal as well. We have one question that came in from Asafa Hailu. What do you think of the book Abyssinia, the Power Barrel by Baron Roman Prochaska, which advised the fascist Italian invaders as the key tool to dismantle Ethiopia? Do you think it is a coincidence?
What was the title again?
The title is Abyssinia, the Powder Barrel.
I haven't read it, unfortunately.
Professor Binyam?
So I haven't read it as well. I do know that there's a certain narrative today that's spreading that tries to identify the political issues around ethnic federalism as somehow external to Ethiopia, and particularly this historical sort of attempt to destroy the state and sort of the methods that were used from the colonial period onwards. To a certain extent, I think there is validity in that. So colonial enterprises, one of the key features is a divide and rule strategy. Interestingly, Mwalimu Ali Mazuri, who was actually my teacher when I was doing political science, master's at Binghamton, we had a discussion, and he was, he would say, Ethiopia is, a civilizational state. It has deep roots. It has different forms as a state, but it's more like a civilization. So how is it that it escaped colonialism, but is now introducing a system that is a hallmark of colonialism, which is ethnic federalism? Right next door in Sudan, the British instituted a form of ethnic federalism. In Sudan, it's analogous to ethnic federalism today. And he found it to be bewildering why a particularly political elite in Ethiopia that prides itself as being sovereign and with this deep history, even with the rancor, nevertheless prides itself on that, would introduce a colonial instrument of divide and rule. And that is one of the key problems that we have today. I think what's more salient is actually to look at the key players. Professor Vestal was very, his point in terms of Herman Cohen and the US role and the geopolitical context and the Cold War is a very important backdrop to understand how ethnic federalism itself comes to the surface. There's various alternatives that could have worked out, but that's one important element to see. I think for the reform movement that most Ethiopians today recognize, ethnic federalism is a ticking time bomb. It's not going to allow the current government to survive another 30 years. They can kiss that goodbye because, again, ethnic federalism has incentivizes political actors. It's actually very rewarding to political actors, right? Whether it's for power, whether it's for unaccountability. Ethnic federalism doesn't run on issues. It runs on identity, right? So if you have someone that looks like you in power, that's it. If you look at every region of Ethiopia, there is no democracy. It's authoritarianism. But Tigray was an authoritarian state, right? Under the TPLF. So ethnic federalism has these incentives in it for actors to continue, but it's not going to allow another 30 years like the TPLF. I think what's interesting is actually to look at both the internal issues that we were discussing, but a key player here is really the conflict, the geopolitical context here of the US and its interest in the region. And the way I see it, I think there is a consistent support for a ethnic federal arrangement in the Horn of Africa, particularly for Ethiopia, right? This ethnic federal system that creates a very polarized, relatively weak, and a central government that most likely needs external support because of the weakness inside. And a certain extent, ethnic federalism makes a state that has to use force, not consent, but force in order to maintain the contradictions that we just slightly touched on. So I would think that one of the objectives that we have is to make sure that external players that are pushing for greater levels of entrenchment of ethnic federalism and division should be pushed out, So that's the way I would think of it as more useful for us today.
Thank you. That was extremely insightful. Thank you so much. And please, attendees, feel free to raise your hands. You're able to speak as well. We'll unmute your mic so you can ask questions directly to the panelists. In the meantime, oh, there you go. I see Asaf Faharlu has raised his hand. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I raised a question about the book by a foreign diplomat who was expelled from Ethiopia in early 1930s, just before the Italian invaders occupied the country. And the book is translated into Amharic by the famous Ethiopian artist named Debbebe Shetu. And it details what Ethiopia is facing now as an administrative, calling names one of the leading nation builders. They call it the Amhara. So they claim every failure of that country to this this ethnic group. And now when you see Ethiopia, the ethnic Amhara is being hunted on every corner of the country. So this has been, narrated for the past 30, 40 years by the ruling TPLF party. Now we are leaving that book. So, he is not responsible, but we are responsible for what our country is facing now. But I think I don't believe it is a coincidence. We are leaving that. And one of the generals of the invading Italian force is also quoted in some presentations as having the same details as this book. So, it gives something. I was expecting somebody with a research would mention this, and it is not mentioned. That's why I raised the question. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ato Safa. We appreciate your question. We have Jonas Geda as well. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Actually, it's a morning where I am here. Great presentation by Professor Vestal and Professor Binyam. Really, I have read about Professor Vestal's work over the last several years. I have a little hobby in Ethiopian history. I'm actually a professor of neurology and psychiatry. But my good friend Bahru Zaude and others, their work has been fascinating. So my question and concern is about academic freedom. Academic history. The history department of Haile Selassie University or Addis Ababa University has been really one of the most productive. It has produced some classic works, the work of Taddese Tamrat and others. Definitely Taddese Tamrat's The Church and the State is considered as a classic work. And he has used primary sources. In fact, for sure, Taddese Tamrat and Baharuzadeh and others have used scientific method to chronicle Ethiopian history. So one thing I've observed is that in the last 30 years, since 1991, Ethiopian History Department has been almost targeted. So I think, don't you think we should leave academic history alone? I think decoupling academic history from politics would serve, in the long term, it serves the interest of Ethiopia and Ethiopians. So for short-term political gain, it had been targeted. So I hope, maybe, I think, don't you think it's time to appeal to ethnic politicians to leave alone academic history so that it can do its work with academic freedom? And in fact, it has done a lot of contribution to establish Ethiopian identity over thousands of years. So I wanted to hear your reflection on this. Thank you very much.
If I may speak to problems that came with the TPLF, the university suffered very badly because faculty were in effect fired from their positions. And to give a political reason for getting rid of faculty is unacceptable. So the idea of tenure is very significant, and that should have been a protection of some of the people who were in a very uncomfortable position because of their political views. So I think academic freedom and being able to speak out is very significant for the university. It was good for the United States because many of the brightest and best of the professors came here to the US, and as a result, we've profited from the unfortunate situation, and I'm not sure the university has ever recovered fully from what happened. But the professors who have held on and have been concerned with some of the matters that you're raising, I think have done excellent work, and I hope they'll continue to be able to do that type of work in a setting of academic freedom.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And Professor Vestal, Professor Binyam, you have anything to add there?
I would say that to ask ethnic entrepreneurs to leave history alone is like asking someone not to drink water. History is the way in which the ethnic project is constructed. And one of the interesting things, it was an opening, an opportunity. And I was a student at that time, I think 9th grade or something, but still I was very excited. For me, one of the things that was very exciting was that the history that we have by noted historians, in many cases, one of the issues with the historiography is a focus on the glorification of the state. Right? So it could be from this king to that king, to that king, to that king, and what happens, as important as that is. So this temporal sort of bias, if you will, leaves out actually peoples, cultures, various actors. So for instance, there's a recent book on Adwa in which the role of women in the victory of Adwa, in terms of from logistics to fighting, etc., to morale, is excavated to show, right? So it's no longer about the key actors in the state itself. And so I think there was an opening for, again, accounting time. This is a place that has been continuously inhabited by different groups for quite some time. So to get a rich memory of that and a memory that we can then use for today, that's a possibility. But what has happened is that you have the connection of academic history, which I think Dr. Yunus's question, which is this notion of academics as being objective, dedicated to a scientific work in terms of history, has really been melded with this political project. In fact, different organizations have their own historians that are creating a history that achieves political objectives, right? Different historians. It's actually remarkable to see that. I call it compact historiography. The purpose of the history is not to liberate people, to educate people, etc. The purpose is political in nature. And for that reason, it is biased and has these political sort of leanings. And I think that's also an area I totally agree in which history has to be understood in terms of a move away from ethnic federalism requires a type of historiography that is not going to be a tool of political projects of different groups. And if I may, with the with the previous question, I'm not familiar with that work, but I think one thing we have to be very clear about is that the analysis of the Ethiopian state and the problem, so many problems, in fact, we could say violence, exploitation, the lack of democracy or domination, right? So what is the key problem? The analysis of these ethno-nationalist groups was to see the Ethiopian state, whether it was the monarchy or whether it's the First Republic, 1974 to 1991, and call it an Amara state, right? They ethnicized the state. So the problem was that it was an Amara state. 1991 till the new reform period, there was another analysis that also looked at the problem and said it was a Tigray state, right? And it's a fiction, right? What you have is a political system in which different actors are there. Even if they claim that they are, for Tigray, for Amara, etc. And today we hear also that the new slowly becoming authoritarian state in Ethiopia is now an Oromo state. Again, a big mistake. If you look at the time period in which so-called Amara state existed, some of the most disenfranchised were actually Amara farmers. Some of the most disenfranchised, right? You could look at in terms of the data itself. So this is a very problematic nature. But the questioner, I think Abarra, Dr. or Mr. Ato Abarra was absolutely correct. The way in which you can actually try to destroy the Ethiopian state is to look at its linchpin. One of them is religion. And so one of the key sort of religions is Orthodox Christianity. So trying to attack that is a very important element if you want to deconstruct the state. The second element, I think the Amara speaking community, which is not an ethnic group. Amara are not an ethnic group. They've been forced to become an ethnic group. But Amara as a linguistic community that has various diversities has always been pan-Ethiopian. That's its primary identity. In fact, the quite severe problems over the past 30 years targeting the Amara community, disenfranchising the Amara speaking community, has been actually because it has been not organized as an ethnic sort of community. Right, and that's one of the issues. So I think the consistent attempt to attract that community is because it is the repository, not the only one, by the way. There's other communities as well, but it's the repository of a pan-Ethiopianism that goes again that threatens an ethnic project. That is one. And the other element, I think, with respect to the persecution of those that speak Amara, particularly outside of the so-called homeland, Amara Kilil, Amara province, is part of this drive for ethnic cleansing, right? Particularly in Oromia. And this is a drive of ethnic cleansing. And where does that come from? Not because of just the political entities, but ethnic federalism itself. We even see this, by the way, in Benishangul Gumuz, where there's an attempt to try to ethnically cleanse different groups within that. It's a very kind of interesting battle between Gumuz, Oromo, and Amara as well, regarding who is going to live there and who has the right to live there. So again, this is something that is inherent in this ethnic federal system. So I just wanted to address the gentleman's sort of question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Biniam. We have a couple of hands raised. I saw Fitsum, I believe, first. Let's go ahead. Fitsum.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Yes. Good afternoon. Yeah, I think Professor Biniam, I think hit the nail on the head. I have been studying or observing what's going on in Ethiopia over the past 30 plus years. And I think the main thing that is ethnicization of the Amhara, or basically blaming the Amhara for everything that is happening, that are happening in Ethiopia. And I was studying, but basically it meant to be Amhara. And I landed in the book. Prior to that, I was asking the question, what is the origin of Amharic language, right? And different people led me to different sources, and I landed to a book called The Origin of Amharic, written by a certain professor here in the United States. So basically, the Amharic language doesn't belong to any ethnic group, and that understanding is missing in Ethiopia.
Oh, I think we lost Fitsum. I don't know if you've gotten a gist of his question and direction he was going to address it.
Who would you like to address the question? Maybe Professor Besta?
So we can start with you if you have any reflection on that. I don't know if you were able to catch all of his question, but he was disconnected.
I did not hear the full question.
Sure. Okay, no problem.
Yeah, I think, may I rephrase his question if, I was trying to listen. I think his question is, he had a lot of questions about the origin of Amharic, and many sources told him, different things. But then he came across with, this book entitled The Origin of Amharic, and it was written by a certain professor. He didn't mention who. And I think in that book, Amharic language itself is not given to the Amhara people. So I think his question is, could we attribute the modern Amharic language to the Amhara history? That was his question. I feel like. Thank you.
So there's a wonderful article, I think, which is relevant till today. The article is called "Who is an Amhara?" I believe it's in African Identities Journal, if I'm not mistaken. And it could be Masai Makonnen, but I could be mistaken again. But nevertheless, that article is called "Who is an Amhara?" And the fundamental question there is, what is an ethnic group? So this process of taking a language and making it primordial, almost like biological category. So let's take the Oromo community as an example, a very rich and diverse community that straddles and stretches all across Ethiopia, all the way to Wallo. And that community, the Oromo community, according to ethnic federalism and thinking about ethnicity, is defined by language, Oromifa, Orominya. But it's problematic because to be an Oromo, there's many ways one can be an Oromo. The Great Oromo Migration, 16th century, moving onwards from the Gibe states in southern Ethiopia that went all the way and across the Ethiopian, particularly highlands, incorporated different types of people, particularly from the south and other places as well. And so the Oromo community are not an ethnic group that is biological, but it's a cultural community that can incorporate more and more people. The Oromo that went to Wollo, which also extended into Tigray, when you look at social anthropological studies, it's very interesting. They identify themselves, the Raya Azabo, they identify themselves as Tigray, but yet they are the furthest element of the Oromo migration into that community. So we can do this with every single sort of ethnic group that's been identified. It's not fixed and it's not biological. When we think of the way that we're born in terms of biological categories, this is the way we are. We can't change ourselves. Cultural groups and cultural identity are malleable. What ethnic federalism does is it takes language, defines it as ethnicity, and makes that a biological category. And so the relevance of the gentleman's remark regarding the Amharic language is, first of all, to say that the language itself does not belong, even if you wanted to make it a primordial identity, does not belong to any group called Amhara. There's no ethnic group called Amhara. That's first. But second, ethnicity itself, the way it's thought of today as a primordial or biological identity, creates a closure. No one can become an Oromo, no one can become Amhara, no one can become Tigray, no one can become a Somali unless you're born into it, which, by the way, in terms of culture is very problematic. So I think that's where it has very similar connotations to the way race was made in the United States, for instance, right? Racial categories of white and black and so on. These are categories that are made as if they're natural, but they're actually made. Same thing with ethnicity today in Ethiopia's ethnic federalism.
Thank you, Professor Biniam. Professor Vestal, anything to add here? Can you hear us, Professor Vestal?
Yes,
Anything to add here on what Professor Biniam has just said?
he's done such an excellent job. I really don't have anything to add. I know a little about the intricacies of some of the groups you're speaking about, so I'm enjoying learning what has happened with several of these so-called ethnic groups.
Thank you so much, Professor Vestal. You know, having you here, if I may be allowed to just have a dialogue with you, just one question. You know, one of the things that I was concerned about, and I don't know if it's actually a legitimate concern, was, you know, when you looked at as a participant during the early periods when ethnic federalism was constructed, and it created an Ethiopia, and it also, by the way, created a new Eritrean state that was one and the same sort of midwifing. I think the U.S. played a big role. Do you think the U.S., because the State Department and various officials have come out and actually identified ethnic federalism as a huge threat to the Ethiopian state, and of course a threat to democracy, do you think there's an interest in terms of the U.S. in seeing a move away from ethnic federalism, or do they see an interest in terms of the larger goals with respect to battling China and Russia on the African continent, of using sort of ethnic federalism, that it actually might gel well for them? What's your view on that?
Right. I think they're more concerned at the present time with the China card. You know, it's such a difference in all of Africa, and I think the State Department is trying to figure out what to do. It's a new game, and China has played their cards very well in terms of becoming much more significant. When I was in Ethiopia, the little kids along the road would yell "Faringe, bye-bye," and yell "China, China." So the world is changing, and the State Department is concerned, I think, primarily with this global aspect of China being so significant in so many different areas. And I think that has their attention. If ethnic federalism can be used to somehow keep a Chinese hegemony at bay, then I think that would be the significance of why they might be interested in continuing with ethnic federalism.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think we are towards the end of this session. But I would like to give you an opportunity to say a couple of words, unless Fitsum, that I don't know if you've heard the response to your question, or I don't know if it was your previous hand raised. Hopefully you didn't miss the response.
Are the pictures and audio still showing up where you are?
Yes.
I seem to have lost them on my computer. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you and see you okay.
Okay. I'll just wait and hope that the pictures
Sounds good. Thank you. And we have about 2 minutes. So Fitsum, if you want to go ahead and then conclude your thoughts.
I would jump all the way to where we are now in terms of Ethiopia with your Nobel laureate doing some very interesting things in terms of a new Ethiopia. Abai is the embodiment of purpose in dismantling an extraordinary irrigation of powers appropriated by his EPRDF predecessors. He's demonstrated determined statesmanship in correcting course and significantly redistributing power within the ruling coalition government. He packed his cabinet with women and oversaw far-reaching political changes. The prime minister's reforms basically match one for one the significant criticisms aimed at the TPLF, EPRDF since it came to power. And those were my personal criticisms also. He decriminalized political movements that have been accused of treason and has made a great difference in bringing hope to the country. And I think his book, it is a wonderful addition to Ethiopian literature. And I hope that will be the basis of a new Ethiopia as a multicultural nation encompassing a dizzying diversity of languages, religions, and geographic identities. And I hope Ethiopia will do well in the fight for freedom, pluralism, the rule of law, human rights, a free press, an independent judiciary, peace, decency, and humanity. And it would be a lasting victory for the post-Cold War democratic version of Ethiopia. I hope you can make it so.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Vestal. And before we move on to Professor Biniam, I'm hearing that there are last questions that our participants would like to raise. If you could please be mindful of time and raise your questions in a more of a comprehensive manner. Thank you. Ms. Hyde, do you want to allow them to speak?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
This is Jonas Geda. So thank you again. I think I agree. We need to have academic freedom, particularly, academic history has to be preserved. I don't know, Professor Biniam, I'm not sure if you have seen the work of Taddese Tamrat's The Church and State. It is actually not, it covers culture, it covers several things. In fact, his PhD work was sponsored by University of London School of Economics, I think. and he went back to Ethiopia. He got the permission of the Patriarch Basilius to go and look at primary sources in the monasteries in Tigray, Gondar, and Gojam. In fact, he identified 19 primary sources. So definitely his work was not limited to about monarchs and others. It covers culture. It was a really very serious scholarly work. The same is true of Professor Bahru Zawde's work. I'm just mentioning what I'm familiar with. A history of modern Ethiopia. In fact, the introduction is worth reading carefully because it's 10 pages, but it summarizes the Ethiopian history, at least those done serious works from 400 BC up to 1974, Carlo Rossini, Taddese Tammarat, and other works. So, and really, in his introduction, it covers about migration of people from south-north, from north-south. So actually, I understand in a history in Ethiopia usually is about the emperors and kings. We take this as a truism, which is not correct, actually. In fact, the serious scholars have addressed the migrations, culture, and the role of women as well, in fact, regarding Taito and others. So I think at least Professor Baharu's work, Taddese Tammarat's work, and in fact, Carlo Rossini are credited to have covered several areas. I just wanted to bring that to attention. And another good news is Professor Brahanu, the new education chief, apparently has prepared the groundwork for academic freedom, and he's trying to legislate academic freedom to universities and autonomies. I think that's it. I'm very hopeful about that happening, being realized. So thank you.
Thank you for citing two of my friends and favorite historians. I miss seeing both of them.
Thank you for that feedback and question. And I believe we have one more. Let's go ahead.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Okay, my name is Almas Tafara. First, I'm very grateful for the depth of education and information that I received from both professors. And I get excited when I hear the word Peace Corps because I used to teach Peace Corps volunteers Amharic. So Professor Vesta, that's exciting to hear anything about Peace Corps. But my question is, I'm trying to suck up all this deep information, but Professor Biniam said the way to solve the current problem is by creating a nation with equal rights for everyone and by being very inclusive. Considering the current situation in Ethiopia, how is that possible? And my other question is, I don't know about time, were there other countries that went through what we are going through and managed to solve it, other than, South Africa, I guess, is racial, but that had different ethnic groups and went through this disintegration, but became finally, overcame it. Thank you very much for everything.
Thank you for mentioning the Peace Corps. I think there have been about 2,000 Peace Corps volunteers from the United States who have served in Ethiopia over the years, and it has meant so much to them. They are your country's great supporters and wish you the best, and they would like to help any way they can in your transition to a new form of democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I believe we can move on to last thoughts from Professor Biniam, unless you have anything to add on the previous person's feedback.
Oh, yes. I need to respect her wonderful question, obviously.
Sure.
I was just patiently waiting. But first, with respect to the history, by the way, I totally agree with Dr. Jonas, and these are fabulous historians. In fact, I think the history of history writing as an academic discipline in Ethiopia is one of the richest and most distinguished from a scientific perspective, and no question about it. But it was simply trying to say that possibility of expanding it. So for instance, Professor Muhammad Hassan on the history of the Oromo is a wonderful book that came also in this light. There's a really interesting history regarding different cultures and civilizations in Ethiopia. So for instance, the Gondar and Muslim community within Gondar as an example, on and on and on. And I was just trying to indicate that we have actually 1,000 flowers and let them bloom. So the prospect for that type of history, and again, this is about memory making, about understanding the cultural makeup and historical experiences of various groups that make up, let's say this, I would say more of a civilizational state. And so that gives us ways in which we can understand the past and also forge, of course, the present and the future. Memory and how memory is constructed is very important. And the idea of academic freedom is very much central. I mean, I'm an academic and I value that as well. So I just thank Dr. Jonas for bringing that up. And I totally agree with respect to Taddus Tamrat, Bahru, and of course, the type of historiography that exists in Ethiopia. To the sister that asked this question of how is it possible to bring a transition, just very briefly, so the question is, how do we make a state? Or another way to put it is, what kind of government do we want? And this is a question that different groups around the world are asking themselves. It's not peculiar to Ethiopia. And the idea of Ethiopia also as multi-ethnic is nothing unique. I don't think there's a single ethnic, there are very few that ethnically homogenous, culturally homogenous, perhaps Japan, and even Japan has one or two small minorities. One of the areas in which I'm researching, and because it has an interesting analogy to Ethiopia's condition, is on one side is actually the experiences of African colonial states, which is really interesting. It's not about the Soviet Union and the policy of nationalism that was introduced by Stalin, not Lenin, but Stalin, because that's one of the ways in which the TPLF and other groups within Ethiopia, the ethno-nationalists, they devised their project, alluding to Stalin's policy of nation and nationality. But I find it interesting that African states that won independence, but that experienced colonialism and are trying to create a state and a nation, which are very distinct. One of the problems I think that we've had is that a nation state, that one people, one religion, and one language, one culture, right? That illiberal type of state is one that was rejected, including by the 1974 revolution. So where do we go from here? I think that's still a possibility, even as problematic as we are right now today. So one is to study not just the South African case, but other African states that have similar problems. And the second, obviously, is China and its nationality policy. China is the other one that has a nationality policy very similar, again, to the 1974 until today Republican experience. And China, with respect to, with the exception of the Han, has perhaps, 65 to 90 different ethnic groups, minorities. So how have they constructed a functioning state and a political community that's inclusive? So that's an area that I'm interested in kind of investigating further to see concretely, how do we move forward? But one of the ways we move forward is to demand equality. So discrimination on the basis, even in the Ethiopian constitution and the international obligations that Ethiopia has signed on to, discrimination on the basis of race, sexual orientation, and of course, on ethnicity, right, religion, is not allowed. And yet, that's the basic pillar of the system, is legalized discrimination on the basis of identity, particularly ethnicity. And so one way that we can move and focus our energy on is to abolish legalized discrimination. It's not simply about saying equality. Legalized discrimination is the way I would put it to our sister's question.
Thank you so much, Professor Biniam, and thank you, Professor Vestal. We really appreciate your time and for allowing us to, pick your brains on some of these questions and hear from your years and years of research and study. We appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you for our participants as well for really giving us your valuable time to give us your attention, your active participation and questions and discussions. We appreciate all of your time. Thank you so much. And we'll see you hopefully on another webinar and public forum that we're going to do in the future. Thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful Sunday afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.